All right, I know I'm supposed to have an immediate hot take reaction to the Trump raid, or not raid, as the FBI prefers to call it. It turns out it's just like recession. It's just another word that doesn't apply even when you see it right in front of your eyes. And I'm not saying those who do are wrong. It's just that I really don't. Of course, not because it isn't justified to be frustrated and to call this what it appears to be, and almost certainly is, unprecedented, lawless, third world, take your pick of the adjectives currently circulating, but because in the context in which this story fits, I'm not sure either the headline or the specifics really matter all that much. I'm not sure the specifics matter because even if we get them, we're relying on a corrupt system to assure us it is not in fact corrupt. I'm not sure the headline matters because it's another piece in a larger system of abuse that has to be addressed regardless. So is this story individually important and significant? Yeah, of course. But the broader issue is much more so. It's just one more episode of a federal government that's completely drunk on its own power. What I'm saying is, even if the Trump not raid is based on a rock-solid legal case with indisputable evidence of a serious crime that's prosecuted for obvious non-political reasons, that federal power drunkenness still remains. And so does the question, what are we going to do about it? You can remove the entire Trump not raid from consideration, and a long list of what are we going to do about it still remains. They devalue our money through out-of-control spending, a huge portion of which isn't even spent in our own country at all, and a huge portion of that doesn't even reach its intended foreign destination anyway. It just disappears into the inflationary ether, and you're expected to wave a foreign flag, or at least post that flag's emoji in celebration of it, because that's who you're helping. And certainly not any corrupt power interests who are just laundering the money through a country otherwise famous for exactly that sort of corruption, but definitely not this time. And the only solvent component of financing that mess is, of course, the theft of what devalued money you do have, that financing scheme sustaining itself by hiring an army of henchmen tasked with nothing other than your continued compliance or your imprisonment. They take your lunch money and use a portion of the proceeds to hire more bullies to take more lunch money. They steal from you, or they take away your capacity to earn. And supposedly there's some illusion of freedom in that choice. All the while, they threaten your dissent as terroristic and push to disarm you should you or your community ever dare think about resisting their predations. All under the laughable premise that they work to serve you. No, they pluck your wallet and slap you across the face, and half this country believes that is a service in your best interest for which you should be thankful. And the only thing funnier to them is when you notice the president's son openly and provably committing crimes, often on video, which receive no such response. Double funny if you notice that the president himself is often implicated in these schemes. The only time they laugh harder than they do at the taking of your lunch money is when you actually expect them to enforce the same rules against their own. So no, of course I'm not saying that the Trump not raid story doesn't matter. I am saying that the truth of what happened with it is sort of like the difference between execution by firing squad or just a single bullet to the back of the head. We can debate the small differences, but in either scenario, there's a fatal threat to be addressed. One more or one fewer guy on that squad doesn't really make a difference. The question remains, what are we going to do about it? Well, I understand and generally respect all the calls to vote this way or vote that way for Congress in the fall, and once the right people have power there, they'll investigate this, and they'll oversee that, and they'll prosecute this, and they'll fire that. All of these approaches neglect the fundamental truth that the federal government is the problem. It's like asking for mob reform. Just put better gangsters in place, and then we'll have a kinder, gentler mob. I suppose maybe some mobs are better than others, but the real solution is we have to dismantle the mob. The federal government is the problem. And so no matter how qualified or virtuous or justifiably vengeful a candidate for federal office is, the solution is not through the federal government itself, because the federal government is terrible at everything. And so it's foolish to expect a suddenly good job at relinquishing its own power, no matter who you send to do it. As long as we choose the federal sword as the solution, we are marching toward conflict, because the more power is centralized, the fewer political remedies remain. Once power is fully centralized, there are no more political remedies that remain because one side owns all the political means and the other has none. And when there are no more political means, other means will be deployed. And I say that with regret, not endorsement. I hope we don't ever see it. But it is the reality of this path. If you don't want people to choose violence, there have to be choices other than violence. But as those political options erode, there is a final important one to address this problem of a federal government seizing ever more power and corruptly wielding it to seize even more. This isn't something new or something novel to our time. This is a problem that the founders foresaw, and it's a problem for which they created a constitutional solution, a mechanism for states to lawfully and peacefully recover the power that is rightfully theirs. It's an Article 5 Convention of States. Article 5 of the Constitution is just one brief paragraph detailing the process for amending the Constitution. And importantly, there is a process to do that without the involvement of DC corruption at all. Throughout our country's history, all constitutional amendments have been added through a 2/3 congressional passage and ratification in 3/4 of the states. But that's not the only way to do it. 2/3 of the state legislatures can also get the process started by calling a convention to propose amendments. So you want to curtail or dismantle the FBI, or the DOJ, or the ABC, or the XYZ, or whatever combo of Fed letters you pick. This is how you do it without the consent or consideration of the entrenched federal interests incentivized to protect themselves at our expense. The states and the states alone call a convention to amend the Constitution to better reflect what the founders intended, the will of the states and the will of the people, not the will of an unaccountable central power. And speaking of diminishing or eliminating the political means, the propagandists are hard at work discrediting this one too, because there is already a movement to get this done well underway. And of course, instead of a proper description of what is a perfectly legitimate constitutional method for reform, a convention of states was described in a Business Insider expose pushed as a Twitter trend just last week as a Republican play to scare the hell out of Washington by rewriting the Constitution. Well, first of all, yeah, the lack of fear in Washington is a problem, because when there is no fear, there is abuse, hence the issue. But note how this method, again, the constitutional, lawful, peaceful method of resolving that issue, is portrayed as some sort of extremist tactic. Conservatives are pushing for this unprecedented move to rewrite the country's bedrock text dating back to 1788. Well, it's in the bedrock text from 1788. It's not unprecedented. It's very precedented by the text itself. Just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it lacks the same legal legitimacy that Congress has used to conduct this process dozens of times, but this article presents it as though it's some illegitimate usurpation of power. It's a new frontier that would reshape every aspect of American law and society. It's a rerouting of constitutional amendment power away from Washington. Well, is it a rerouting away from the states when Washington does it? Why is one route presumed to have more legitimacy when both hold the same constitutional authorization? Why is the constitutional text a sacred bedrock, except for this one particular piece of the constitutional text? It's because the presumption, either by error or by succumbing to their own propaganda, is that the federal government bosses everyone around, that we exist to serve it and not the proper other way around. That presumption is the problem, and it's exactly what this constitutional provision was designed to fix. So what are the prospects of the fix if I'm going to say that reducing the federal government to its proper scope through the federal government is way too long of a long shot? Well, this approach must be something shorter, and while it's by no means short, I do think its prospects for success are fairly realistic. The group organizing the effort is called Convention of States Action. The proposed resolution is very simple and broad. It calls for a convention of states to make proposals that, quote, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, impose fiscal restraints, and place term limits on federal officials. As Article 5 prescribes, once 2/3 of state legislatures, 34 of them, pass that resolution, the convention can be held, though of course that convention would only hold the power to propose amendments. To install these constitutional amendments, it will take state legislature ratification in 3/4 of the states. That's 38. But at least to get the process started, the numbers are not that far off. The resolution is passed in 19 states already. In 6 more, it's passed one chamber of the legislature, which means it's on the cusp of 25. And in 22 more states, the resolution is under consideration in 2022. In other words, the convention itself is already more than halfway there, with continued momentum toward the threshold. Now, granted, consideration in New York or Illinois, I wouldn't be very optimistic about, but there are some points for at least a little hope. As of now, Republicans have full control of 30 state legislatures and split control of 2 more. And unless we see historic election fortification beyond even 2020's levels, it is a safe bet that number will rise in the fall. And while passing laws is rarely straightforward or easy, and certainly doing it across dozens of states simultaneously is even harder, this process isn't quite as difficult as normal legislation. Notably, the resolution to call for and participate in the Convention of States is solely the state legislature's jurisdiction. Only the legislature needs to pass it. The governor does not need to sign it. The courts have no say in the matter either, at least as the Constitution prescribes. So is it optimistic to believe that 3/4 of state legislatures are going to sign on to limit the federal government in this way? Sure, but I don't think it's nearly as much of a delusionally rosy stretch as it is to believe that Washington is going to reform itself so long as we just vote for this guy or that guy to go there instead. And it is necessarily rosy enough to exhaust all political means to achieving that reform without prematurely resorting to the sort of messy conflict that the central power seems bent on baiting. What it all means is the primary importance of the vote in the fall is not actually who you send to Congress, though of course that does matter. But if we actually want to end this madness, who you send to your state house and your state senate actually holds the more realistic key to solving this problem through the peaceful political means. If the solution is local power, well, then we have to focus our power locally, because it's either the peaceful decentralization of that power through the lawful means, or it's the conflict inherent to the centralization of that power. There is no solution by which the central power is wielded correctly. To the propagandists who say otherwise and dismiss the lawful, peaceful method as illegitimate, understand you are saying there is no recourse to Washington power other than Washington power itself. Because the truth is, there is always recourse to abusive power. It's just some forms are much uglier than others. And if you dismiss or eliminate the pretty forms, the ugly forms that follow are on you. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.